Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are back to our Tanya shir. We are in lesson 7, the seventh lesson. We're about to begin chapter 2. I took my Tanya. I went to New York yesterday for a wedding. I took my Tanya with me with my notes. You never know with air travel if you're going to make it back on time. So I figured maybe I'll give the class from the Minneapolis airport. With Baruch Hashem, we're back in Bozeman. The beautiful Simcha. And now we're back into our soul searching in Tanya. So we left off last week internalizing the idea that the Alter Rebbe quotes from Reb Chaim Vital. We'll call it the doctrine of the two souls, that every single Jew has two souls, and we spent chapter 1 discussing the animalistic soul, the Nefesh HaBahamis, which we explained is embedded in the bloodstream of the person, meaning it's natural to the Jew, and even some of our good traits, because our Nefesh HaBahamis comes from Klipas Noiga, from the Klipa, from the force of negativity that has good hidden within it, that has Noiga, it has light, therefore we are naturally inclined to do certain good things. And I had some interesting conversations with some of our students throughout the week, because they wanted to understand how is it possible that we are naturally inclined, for example, to be goyim lechasadim, to do good, and to be Rahman, and to be merciful and compassionate, but for example, we're not naturally inclined to be besimcha. It was a very interesting, deep conversation. The difference between what is the avodah of a Jew, what is our service of God, meaning it's not natural to us, but we still have the ability to internalize it and make it part of our life through our godly soul and through our service, versus things that are simply natural to us. But with that in mind, to really understand the contrast between the Nefesh HaBahamis and the Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul and the animalistic soul, we have to have a conversation about the godly soul. And as I mentioned at the end of last week's class, the godly soul is unique to the Jewish people. So here we are in Perek Beis, chapter 2, says the Alter Rebbe, the Nefesh Hashenis B'Yisrael, the second soul that exists in a Jew, that's within the Jew, Mamash. It's a piece of God above, and then he adds the word Mamash literally. Now, this concept of a Jewish person having a soul that is a part of God, a piece of God, and then the Alter Rebbe adds the word literally, is not necessarily novel today, but when this was being taught by the Mekubalim, by the Kabbalists in the 16th century, it was definitely considered a novel concept. The first reference to the godly soul as being a chelik alekami mal, we see it in the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero in the 16th century in Pardes Rimonim, and then later his student, the Reishis Chochma, in 1578, mentions this term chelik alekami mal, that a Jewish soul, a godly soul, is a chelik alekami mal, is a piece of God from above. But the Alter Rebbe adds the word mamish, which means literally, that you shouldn't think it's some kind of figurative idea, but that literally there's a part of God within every Jew. There's a soul that is a part of God embedded, infused in every Jew. The first reference to this term mamish, that it's literal, we saw in a sefer of Kabbalah called Shefatal, which was written by a Makubal, by a Kabbalist named Shabsai Sheftel Horowitz, who passed away in 1619. But the Alter Rebbe specifically chose that lingo because the Alter Rebbe and Chassidus Chabad firmly understand and believe, but more than believe, we understand that a Jewish person has a nefesh elokis, a godly soul, that is literally embedded within them. Now, the term mimal and mamash are opposites. Mimal means from above. It represents, like the Rebbe Rashab said, it represents ruchni sheberuchni, the spiritual of the spiritual, the most spiritual thing a person can, the most spiritual thing that can exist. And the word mamish, which means literally, which means it's tangible, is the most physical of the physical. And in the person, the most physical of the physical, we have the ability to have this infinite mimal, this ruchni sheberuchni, the most spiritual of spiritual. And that's a chiddush. That's a novelty of the godly soul. Now, how we got there, how we ended up getting this godly soul infused within us, we'll get to in a moment. But I want to address beforehand the idea The Alter Rebbe refers here in chapter 2 to the godly soul as being Nefesh Hashenis, the second soul, as if it's secondary to the animalistic soul. Now, why would we say that? Okay, you tell me I have two souls, I understand. But to tell me that my godly soul is secondary, it's number two? So the Rebbe addressed this in great detail and a few very important points. Number one, when a person is born, they are born with an animalistic soul. It's their natural soul. Their godly soul, their good inclination, if you wish, the Yetzer Tov, does not come into full immersion into their body, into their life, until they're bar bas mitzvah. For a girl when they're 12 and a boy when they're 13. So naturally, you're going to call the godly soul Nefesh Hashenis, the second soul, because it comes secondary to the Nefesh Bahamas that they're born with, the animalistic soul that they're born with. Furthermore, the only reason we need a godly soul is to transform and elevate and spiritualize the animalistic soul. So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Which comes first? Of course, the animalistic soul comes first, and then you get the godly soul, which is the ability, the God-given ability to rectify or to elevate or to transform the animalistic soul. And that's really the role of the Nefesh Elokis, the role of the godly soul within us is to look at our animalism, to look at our animalistic temptations, our tendencies, and say, I have godly powers within me that give me the ability to transform you and guide you in the right direction. And so the godly soul really needs to be fitted to the animalistic soul because it's going to have to work with the animalistic soul, with the Nefesh Bahamas. And so it makes sense that we should refer to the godly soul, to the Nefesh Elokis, as a Nefesh Hashenis. It also is very, very fascinating, just as a side note, that once we recognize that each of us was given a Nefesh Elokis, that we're not just blood, flesh and blood. We're not just materialistic, physical people that have a little touch of God. We have a little, you have these terms that people throw around. Oh, everyone's got a spark, and everyone's got a soul, and everyone's got a spirit. No. You're a chelik elikami mal mamash. There's a part of God embedded within you, literally. When you internalize that, you start realizing that what it said in chapter 1, the ability that everyone has to be a Beinani, and maybe even be a tzaddik, is not so foreign. We're not asking you to be something that you're not. We're asking you to allow a part of yourself to take control of the other part of yourself and be more godly than animalistic. So now the Alter Rebbe says, how do we know? This idea of a Nefesh Elokis, this idea that there's a divine soul that is embedded into us at our core, where do we know that from? Says the Alter Rebbe, K'moshe Kosov, like it says in Bereshis, Vayipach ba'apov nishmas chayim, that God blew into his nostrils, into Adam, to Adam Arisha, into the first human being that God created by his own handiwork. God blew into his nostrils the breath of life. And that's interesting. The Rambam, Nachmanides, famous 13th century Spanish Mekubal and Torah commentator, says on those words, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, that God blew into his nostrils the breath of life. He says, God breathed into the nostrils a soul of life to inform you that the soul is not derived from the elements, rather it's the Spirit of God. The Rambam Nachmanides is already saying that don't think this is some kind of figurative thing. It's legit, it's literal. Sometimes in Judaism we use guzma, we use exaggeration to make a point. Even in the Torah, even in the verses of the Torah, talks about that there was cities and there were people, psures b'shamayim, towers into the sky. It's not literally into the sky. It's figurative, that they were very big and gigantic. Over here, the Alter Rebbe is saying, I don't want you to think that the Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul that every single Jew has, is figurative, is exaggerated. Don't think that. It's literal. And that's interesting because, many of the debates within Judaism about how we approach another Jew and their relationship to God and the relationship to Judaism. So there were movements, there were schools of thought it was all about what are they doing, what are they learning, and in the process they forgot, or maybe they never knew that there's something much deeper here. That who are they at their core? What is their mohus? What is their essence? And the Alter Rebbe is telling us based on Kabbalah. So if you're not necessarily a chassid of Chabad, but the Pardes Rimoim, the Ramak, the Reishis Chachma, these are the Mukabalim, and they're teaching us that every single Yid, every single Jew is a chelik of the Kamimal. So first of all, we know that God breathed into Adam Arishon's nostril the breath of life. What's the difference in when you blow something, as he's going to explain in a moment, when you have to blow up a balloon, it takes a lot more effort than when you're speaking. So when God created the world, it says, Basaram Amoris Nivra Olam. God used 10 utterances. Right? So it's sort of an external force. Matter of factly, God created the world. We say in the morning in davening, we say, Atu Achali Nivra Olam, Atu Mish Nivra Olam. You're the same God before you created the world, after you created the world, meaning it was almost like a side gig. I created the world, it has purpose, but it didn't take much effort. But when it came to creating Adam Arishon, it came to Adam, he blew into his nostrils. Like we say in the davening every single morning, we say, Neshama shenasata be the soul that you put in me, ta'iri atavrasa, you created it, that the yitzarta, you formed it. Then we say, v'ata nafachta be, you blew it into me. So the Alter Rebbe says, v'ata nafachta be, the same ideas in this phrase, the soul that you breathed into me, that you blew into me. As it says in the Zohar, and I should mention right here, right now, that we do not find this in the Zohar, in our text, in our prints. The only place we find this statement is in the Sefer Emek HaMelech, which is a Sefer of Kabbalah from the 17th century, for Tali Hertz Bachrach. So in Emek HaMelech it has this, we don't see it in the Zohar, but the idea is still in Kabbalah. What is the idea? Man de nafach mitoiche nafach. One who blows from his innards. Pirush mitech yusei, meaning from the innermost depths of his being. Shetoich yisuprimis achayishu ba'adam. For when a person blows forcibly, he exhales with a deep-rooted inner energy. When someone blows something up, when he exhales deeply, that's not the same as speaking. It's a much, much bigger avodah. It's a much bigger, it takes a lot more energy and effort. It's not superficial like speech. It's essential. So when it says that God blew into Adam Arishon and gave him life, the Alter Rebbe is saying that what he was giving him in that moment was giving a part of his essence into every Jew that became the genetic DNA of every single Jew later. That we have we have a piece of God within us. Now, the natural question that comes to mind is, Adam Arishon, Adam wasn't Jewish. So shouldn't this be for everyone? And it's true. Adam was the neshama klolis. He was the general soul for all of humanity. He's the father of all human beings, not just Jews. But there's a very interesting teaching. And that is, just like a parent can have a lot of talents and a lot of genetic gifts and a lot of, epigenetics, whatever they have, it doesn't mean their child will carry the same, every single thing that the parent had. They'll get some of it, not all of it. And it doesn't make the parent have any less. Adam Arishon, says Chassidus, had this incredible thing that he had a Nefesh Elokis, a godly soul blown into him, and that was passed on only to some of his children spiritually, and that was through Avraham Avinu to Klal Yisrael. So just because all people originate with Adam, and we are referencing verses here about Adam Arishon, does not mean that every human being has a Nefesh Elokis. Clearly they don't. Every human being has a Nefesh Avahamis, an animalistic soul. Nefesh Elokis is a gift that was given to Adam and then transferred to the Jewish people for each of us to have as a Jew. Now that we understand why the Nefesh Elokis is this unique embodiment, this unique infusion of a piece of God literally into us, We want to take it to the next level to illustrate how intimate the connection is between God and the Jewish people in the Nefesh Elokis, in the godly soul. Says the Alter Rebbe, this gets very interesting. Kachal derech mashul, neshamas Yisrael alu b'machshava. In the same vein, the Medrash says in Medrash Rabbah that the Jewish souls, they arose, they have arisen in the mind of God. So before Hashem created the world, he already thought in his mind, obviously God doesn't have a mind, but in his figurative mind, he already had in mind the Jewish people. And then we have these very two interesting verses in the Torah. One in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy, one in Shmois and one in Dvarim. B'ni b'chayri Yisrael, as the verse says, Israel, my firstborn son. So the Jewish people are referred to as God's firstborn son. And then in Dvarim it says, Bani matim l'Hashem Elokeichem, you are children to God your God. What's the connection here? The fact that God thought about us before he even created the world, and the fact that we're called children or the firstborn of God. What's the connection? So here the Alter Rebbe is going to talk about the biological birth of a child and how the child originates in the father's brain, and how that relates to the relationship of the Jewish people and God as our Father. So he says, Pirush, which means, just as a child is derived from the brain of the father, which is a quote from the Kunei Zoyar, from the Zoyar, likewise, each person in Israel is derived from God's blessed thought and wisdom, so to speak. So just like a child originates in the father's brain, so too every Jew originates in God's wisdom and God's thought. Now, let's understand this for a moment. From a long, long time ago until fairly recently, maybe the early modern era, it was believed that male seed, physical seed that gives birth to children, was physically derived from the cerebral part, matter in the brain of the father, passed down from the brain through the spine, exiting through the duct at the spine's base, and giving birth eventually through their spouse to a child. Now, later, obviously, anatomically, this turned out not to be exactly correct, but the Kabbalists accepted the idea on a spiritual level, that where a child first originates is in the father's brain when he decides he would like to bring a child into the world, and it has a process till eventually it comes into a physical action in a relationship to bring about that child. And similarly, Hashem had a thought process way before the Jewish people ever came to be, before the world was even created. Cerebrally, in God's brain, figuratively, he already had in mind that he would like to bring us into fruition, and we are the result of that. We are the child born from that. We are the child that came about from that. So think of that. Not only are we some random creation created by God's speech, we come from when he breathed into the nostrils of Adam, from the essence. He gave us a piece of himself. And where did it originate? In God's chachma and God's thought. Now, why is that so powerful? So he says, because when it comes to God's thought, it's not like our thought process. He's not a human being. But before I get to how God's thought works, I want to emphasize an important point. He quoted earlier 2 verses to talk about that we're children of God. One of them was, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem, you, atem, you are children of the Lord your God. And the other one is, B'ni b'chayri Yisrael, my son, my firstborn Israel. Why do you need both verses to teach us that we're children of God? They both say the same thing in different words. A firstborn is also a child. So I saw a beautiful, beautiful teaching from one of the Rebbes. And that is, in Ethics of Our Fathers, it says, Chiba Chavivin Yisrael, Jewish people are precious to God, that we're like children, Shenikru Banim. because we're children of God. We're precious like children. Then it says chiba yisera. They have an additional preciousness, noidas lahem, that they happen to know that they're precious. So there's one level of being precious where you happen to be precious, and then there's another layer of precious when you actually have the knowledge that you are considered precious in the eyes of God. Think about it. If a child is precious to their parents, okay, that's an obvious. Or at least for most people, it should be an obvious. But what if the parent never tells the child, and the child has no idea that they consider the child precious? The only thing they ever hear from their parent is negativity. Do this, don't do that. You stop there, move, go, stop. Instead of, hey, every day I wake up and I want you to know, my dear, that you're the most precious thing in the world to me. Knowing that, for a child to know that, adds exponentially in their relationship, in their recognition of their preciousness. So when God says, Israel, you're my firstborn, wonderful. So God considers us his firstborn. But do we know about it? That's where the other verse, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. Atem means you. It's like God telling us, you are my children. I want you to know you are my children. I want you to know I gave you a Nefesh Elokis. Don't sit back there and bemoan that you don't have this, that. I want you to know I gave you my all. In your physical body, in your animalistic soul, in your temptation, in your tendencies, I've embedded you. I've given you this incredible matana, an incredible essential part of my essence. I gave you as a gift, and that is a nefesh elokis, a godly soul that has the ability to do wonders for you if you only recognize that it exists within you. So when, going back to what we were saying earlier, when it says that we originate from God's chachma, from God's machshava, from God's thought, we have to bavarn something. We have to forewarn an issue that can arise from that. Because obviously, right, when you say God's wisdom, we say every soul, every Jewish soul, every godly soul is a piece of God. Now we're saying it's not a piece of God, it's God's wisdom, it's God's thought. Which is it? So that's why he has to explain the iyu chakim v'loy b'chachma yediyah. When you talk about God's wisdom and God's thought, the Zohar says he is wise, but not with wisdom as we know it. When we talk about God's wisdom, it's not like talking about human wisdom. Why? So he explains. Actually, I think part of what we're about to learn is in tomorrow's Rambam. I think tomorrow, in those that study the 3 chapters of Rambam, he's going to talk a little bit about the Rambam's view on this. But for now, let's see what he says inside. But in the case of God, he and his wisdom are one. You can't separate God and God's wisdom and God's thought. Human beings are different. As the Rambam writes, that God, unlike human beings, Hashem is simultaneously the Mada, he's the power to know, and he's the Yedea, he's the knower, and he's the Yedua, he's the known. Now for a human brain, this concept defies coherent logic for us human beings. We have no way to comprehend it, but we have to accept it. So when Zohar says that the Jewish people originate in God's wisdom and God's thought, and you would think, well, that's not God, it's just his thought. He says, no. Human beings, their thought and themselves are separate. I can be a person and I can have a thought. It's not one with me. But with God, the Rambam says clearly that he is that God is the power to know, he is the knower, and he's the known. And there's no way for us to understand it, but that's the fact. Like it says in the verse in Iyov, can you find God by searching? It's also written, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, the prophet Yeshaya says. So if you want to look at tomorrow's Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, chapter 5, Perek Hey, you'll see where he discusses this. Now it's interesting that the Rebbe is quoting the Rambam on this. because it's not such a simple matter. The Maharal of Prague, for example, and a few others argued against this big time. To God forbid use terms of wisdom and thought regarding God and that God's one with us, and they didn't like it. And generally, the Kabbalists didn't like it either, because the Kabbalists always saw God at his core, at his essence, or Ein Sof, an infinite light, and infinite by definition is not wisdom, is not knowledge, it's not thought. So seemingly here, the Alter Rebbe, who's quoting the Kabbalists, he's quoting Reb Chaim Vital, he's quoting the Pardes Rimonim, the Ramak, he's quoting the Reishis Chachma, and he's teaching the Arizal's teaching, and yet the way he's explaining it is in sync with the Rambam, where God and his wisdom are one. How does that reconcile? It is potential for a problem. So how do you reconcile? That's why there's a Hagah. There's a little footnote that the Alter Rebbe wrote to address that. What does he say in the footnote? He says, even though generally the Kabbalists would agree with the philosophy of the Maharal, that God cannot be defined by wisdom. And yet over here, the Alter Rebbe is quoting the Rambam. And actually, Commissioner Kosovo Pardes Meramak, and you look at Ramosha Cordovera's teaching in the Pardes, you'll see him specifically say that God can't be defined by that. The Gam of Kabbalah Rizal Zechariah Levracha. Yatziva Milsa. So here, the Ramak agreed with the Rambam, and even according to Luriana Kabbalah, according to the Arizal, the holy Arizal, we could understand how we can reconcile the Arizal and the Rambam, Kabbalah. How so? And here comes a very foundational idea, and if someone has never studied Chassidus before, this may sound revolutionary, and for those that study Chassidus, it's something that's discussed but needs to be always reiterated because it's such an important point. Rambam understood that God is his knowledge. Kabbalah, on the other hand, refers to God as Ein Sof, some abstract, infinite light that we have no ability to really comprehend and connect with. So how do you reconcile? Says the Alter Rebbe, "B'soidis flapshus Ein Sof Baruch Hu ayidei tzimtzumim rabim b'kelim." That you could contextualize what the Rambam says through the secret doctrine of how the infinite light of God underwent multiple diminishments and contractions to the point that it could enter finite vessels. So here is a terminology that is discussed in Chassidus. It's called Oires and Kalim, lights and vessels. Now, of course, the essential light of God is infinite, which means there's no way that it could manifest itself and permeate anything that's finite. Not something that's physical, but even finite in the higher worlds, right? Atzilus is the world of emanation. And on some level, Atzilus, the world of emanation, the highest of the four worlds, compared to God's essence, is also considered a finite. But certainly in the world of Bria, the world of creation, and the world of Yitzira, the world of formation, and for sure in our world, Olam Asiyah, the world of action. So how could we refer to God who's infinite as being wisdom, which seems to defy everything the Kabbalists teach? So for that, we need to understand this concept of Oris and Kalim, lights and vessels. And that is, the light was so powerful that God in his infinite kindness allowed for diminishments, allowed for contractions, so that some of the light can permeate the lower realms in these realities that we call vessels, that we call Kalim. The fact that we have the ability to comprehend some things of godliness, that we have the ability to tap into spirituality and holiness and light, that is uniquely available because of Tzimtzum. Because as Kabbalah teaches, God allowed for contraction of the light so that the light can be available to us through those vessels. What is the first of those vessels, of those Kalim? The Chachma Bina Das. It's Chabad. The God's intellectual powers in the world of Atzilus, of Chachma, Bina, Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, or inquiry, cognition, and recognition. In the world of emanation. Ach lo l'maylam atzilus. But when the Rambam talks about wisdom, he's not talking about anything above atzilus. Meaning, the only way we can reconcile the Kabbalists and the Rambam is to understand that the Rambam was talking about a level of godliness in which God and his wisdom and his thought are one, which is not, according to the Kabbalists, the essence of God, which is above any form of vessels, any form of finite, and therefore, like the Maharal would say, totally above any ability to be referred to as wisdom or knowledge. But when the Rambam said God is the power to know and the knower and the known, he's referring to the manifestation of God's infinite light, the way it's already in the vessels of Atzilus. And over there, it is indeed possible to have an experience of godliness where you could refer to it as wisdom, or you could refer to it as thought. As explained elsewhere, the blessed infinite light is incomparably higher and more exalted than the energies of Chachma, Bina, and Das of the world of Atzilus. It's one of the hottest lines in the Sefer HaTanya, is right here. You ready for the translation? To the extent that from the perspective of the infinite light, even the energies of Chachma, Bina, and Das of the world of emanation of Atzilus are considered by God as remote as physical action. In other words, yes, we understand what the Rambam's point is as it relates to the manifestation of godliness as it shows up in the world of Atzilus. But to understand at its depth, the way the Kabbalists understood it, the Mukabbalim understood it, the world of Atzilus to God's essence is no different than the world of Asiya, the world of action. So just because it's a holier world and a world of emanation versus creation, formation, or action, that's just the way we perceive it. To the essence of God, to the infinite light, emanation, creation, formation, and action are all the same, as it says, Kulam b'chachma asisa. The verse hints to it in Tehillim and Psalms when it says, you made them all with chachma, right? That you see in that verse the word chachma, which is wisdom, and asisa, you made, action. That action and wisdom to God's infinite light are equal. And the only reason the Alter Rebbe says this in the Haggadah is to make sure we understand that his point is that when the Medrash says that we originate in God's machshava, that the Nefesh Elokis of the Jew, the godly soul of the Jew, originates in God's machshava. Like a father's thought before he procreates and brings a child into the world. God has children. They are the Jewish people. They have a special bond, a Nefesh Elokis, and God's chachma, which is one with him. Again, as explained, the Haggadah is one with him in the realm of Atzilus, but that is a manifestation of God's infinity. The way it comes into the kelim, into the vessels, that is an incredible thing. It's an incredible thing to live with the knowledge that from the day you were born, it started to immerse itself, and by the time you turned bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah, the godly soul is now totally immersed into your existence. So your nefesh habahamis, your animalistic soul, is in natural tendencies, and now you have built into your DNA as a Jew, you have a nefesh elokis, which obviously is going to lead eventually, not this week and not next week, but eventually it's going to lead to a conversation. How does that battle play out? If you have these two incredible forces within you, how does the battle play out? That's obviously where we're going with this. But before we even get there, next week, God willing, we're going to address an important point, which is if we all have a piece of God in us, right? That's what he just said. Every single Jew has a piece of God blown into us from his nostrils, from God into our nostrils. Then how does that work with what we know from other places in Kabbalah, that there's a hierarchy of souls? Can there still be a hierarchy of souls if we all have the same source and it was all blown into us? But to understand that, we'll explain next week. And this will slowly build us in this journey to understand the life, the challenges, the obstacles, the abilities of the Beinoni, But to get there, we first have to understand what their makeup is. And where we are right now is that we know there's two souls. The first soul, the animalistic soul, and the second soul, the godly soul, that is embedded in our animalistic soul and comes from the oneness that expresses itself in God's wisdom when he originated us in his original thought, because we are his children that come from that thought. But how that plays out in relation to other neshamas, and does that mean that every neshama is equal or not? That we will discuss Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach next week. We look forward to seeing you back here next Thursday for lesson 8. Afreilichen Erev Shabbos. We're in Chodesh Adar. Actually, if you looked at today's Hayom Yom, it was all about the power of emes. It was all about how much Chassidim took this idea of being truthful to heart. It's such an important attribute that as we study through this journey, it's not going to be an easy journey. It's a derech aruka ktsara, as we said in the beginning. It's the long, short way. First, you got to go through the long avodah, then we're going to get to the realization of what it does was. But the avodah is hard, but it's an avodah of truth. If you're looking for instant soul catharsis, there's a great app called Meaningful Minute, and there's Vayemoin. There's all these programs. They give you 2 minutes of godly, fluffy inspiration. It's wonderful. It really is. But if you want to transform your essence and you want to be a yid that lives with truth in service of their creator, knowing what the makeup is, for that you got to journey through Tanya. That's a derech haruka ktsara. We'll see you back here next week. Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach. I'm going to end the recording and then I will open it up for questions. Just a moment.